The restaurant lights sparkled, glasses clinked, and laughter floated across the hall. Ao sat quietly at the long table, expecting nothing more than a family dinner. Then his mother leaned in, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "We're not your ATM, Ao," she said loudly, like she wanted the whole world to hear. The words hit him like a blade. Around the table, cousins chuckled, his siblings smirked, and even his father pretended to hide a grin behind his glass. Ao didn't flinch. He simply sipped his drink slowly, his silence heavier than any reply. Inside, though, memories began to burn. Nights of going to bed hungry in university. Working 3 jobs at once just to send money back home. Selling his bike so his parents could keep their house. Every sacrifice flashed before him while they laughed and mocked. They had forgotten everything. To them, he was just a beggar at their table. But Ao's eyes stayed calm, steady, and unreadable. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He let the moment breathe, let their laughter echo. Because deep inside, he knew something they didn't. The night wasn't over. And soon, the table would turn. Laughter circled the table like a cruel song, but Ao barely heard it. His mind slipped far away, back to nights when he had nothing but his books, his dreams, and an empty stomach. He remembered lying in his tiny university room, the walls cracked, the fan broken, his body aching from hunger. Some nights he drank only water to trick his stomach into silence. While his classmates enjoyed parties and outings, he counted coins just to survive till the next day. Yet even in those days of lack, his phone never stopped buzzing with messages from home. "Ao, can you send something? Ao, we need help." And he always answered, even when it meant starving himself. He remembered the jobs too. The night shifts that blurred into mornings, the endless hours waiting tables, packing boxes, tutoring kids just to scrape money together. He ran from one job to the next, his body weak but his will unbroken. While his friends laughed about new sneakers, Ao carried worn shoes with soles almost gone. He never complained, never once reminded his family of what it cost him. He simply sent money home, because family was supposed to mean something. Then came the day he sold his only bike. That bike wasn't just metal and wheels, it was his escape, his small joy in a hard life. But when the call came that the family house was at risk, he sold it without thinking. He walked to class in the hot sun, his shirt soaked, his feet blistered, but he smiled knowing his parents still had a roof over their heads. He never told anyone how much it hurt to give up his only treasure. He just carried on, believing that one day they would see his heart. Now, sitting in that golden restaurant surrounded by sneers, the same people who once depended on him twisted the story. They called him a leech, a beggar, a man who always wanted. They forgot the nights he went without food so they could eat. They forgot the times he wore torn clothes so his siblings could have school uniforms. They forgot that he bled so they could breathe easy. Ao's chest tightened, but not with weakness. It was something sharper, stronger. He looked at their smiling faces and realized the truth: they never saw his sacrifice as love, only as duty. They had erased his pain and painted him as a burden. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to explain himself. Let them laugh. Let them mock. They thought he was still the hungry boy struggling in silence. They didn't know that boy had become a man who built his own empire. So he stayed quiet, his face calm, his eyes cold. He sipped his drink slowly, hiding the storm inside him. They thought he was powerless, but they were wrong. Deep down, Ao knew the time for explanations was over. Soon they would remember every sacrifice. Not because he would remind them with words, but because life itself was about to remind them who truly carried the family through the fire. Segan leaned forward with a grin, his voice sharp enough to slice the air. "Stop acting like we owe you anything, Ao." The table roared with laughter again, cousins clapping each other, siblings shaking their heads as if mocking Ao was the best form of entertainment. Even his father's stiff chuckle joined in, the sound hollow and cruel. To them, this was a game, another night to put him in his place. But Ao's face didn't change. He stayed silent, his glass raised calmly to his lips, his eyes cold and steady. What no one noticed was the waiter hovering near their mother's side. The young man bent low, his voice trembling as he whispered something in her ear. Her hand froze on the platinum card she had just handed over with such confidence. She frowned, waved him off, then pushed the card back toward the machine as if daring it to defy her again. Ao caught every movement. He saw the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her forced smile cracked just a little. The rest of the table kept laughing, unaware that the night was beginning to turn. The machine beeped, loud enough to cut through the noise. Declined. She gave a nervous laugh, brushing it off. It must be the machine. Try again. The waiter obeyed, his hands slightly shaking as though he already knew the truth. Once again, the machine responded with that sharp sound, declined. The laughter around the table faltered this time, confusion spreading slowly like smoke in the air. Cousins exchanged glances. Segan's smirk faded just a little. Ao leaned back deeper into his chair, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer to help. His silence grew heavier with each second, pressing against them more than any words could. His mother's smile was gone now, replaced with tight lips and darting eyes. She reached for another card from her shining wallet, as if the sheer number of them could save her pride. But Ao already knew what was coming. He had seen the whisper, seen the fear in the waiter's eyes. Another beep. Declined again. The table grew restless. The earlier mocking laughter now felt awkward, hanging in the air with nowhere to go. Segan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Their father cleared his throat, his face stiff. No one dared to look directly at Ao, but they felt his presence more than ever. He didn't move, didn't blink, just sat there like a shadow that had been ignored too long. The waiter finally straightened and, with a voice louder than before, announced the truth that none of them expected: all her cards have been frozen. The words landed like thunder, silencing the entire table. The room that had moments ago been filled with jokes at Ao's expense now felt like a courtroom. He set down his glass carefully, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. He had spoken no words, yet the power had already shifted. The night was no longer theirs. It was his. The sharp beep from the machine cut through the table like a sudden clap of thunder. At first, no one paid attention. They thought it was just a small glitch, nothing to notice. But Ao saw the waiter's nervous face, the way his eyes shifted between the machine and his mother. His mother forced out a laugh that sounded too high, too fake. "It must be the machine," she said, waving her hand as if her platinum card could never fail. "Try it again." Her voice carried a hint of command, the tone of a woman who believed money always obeyed her. The waiter nodded quickly, sliding the card again, his hands shaky. Another beep. Declined. This time it rang louder in the silence that was slowly spreading across the table. The cousins who were still whispering jokes froze mid-sentence. Segan looked up from his phone, his smirk shrinking. Even their father's glass stopped halfway to his lips. The laughter that had filled the room moments ago now hung awkwardly, like a joke no one found funny anymore. His mother cleared her throat, trying to hold on to her pride. She opened her wallet, pulling out another shining card, her fingers moving faster now, betraying her calm mask. She handed it over with a forced smile. "Here, this one will work." But her eyes gave her away. They flickered nervously, as if she was already begging the machine to be merciful. The waiter slid it in. Everyone leaned in just a little without meaning to. Another beep. Declined again. The sound hit harder this time, like a bell announcing the shift of power. The restaurant around them went on with its music and clinking glasses, but at their table, the air had changed. Cousins exchanged glances. A sibling let out a nervous cough. No one laughed anymore. No one teased Ao anymore. And Ao? He moved slower than all of them. He lifted his glass, took a small sip, and then set it down carefully on the table. That simple act felt like thunder. His silence was no longer just silence, it was a blade cutting through their pride. Every second he remained quiet made them sweat harder. Every calm movement of his hand felt like a reminder that he was not the weak one here. His mother's smile was gone now. Her hands trembled as she reached for another card. Segan shifted in his chair, the confidence drained from his face. Their father finally set his glass down without drinking, staring at the table instead of at Ao. The cousins who had chuckled the loudest now kept their eyes on their plates, afraid to meet his gaze. Ao didn't need to say a single word. His stillness was louder than all their laughter had been. They had mocked him minutes ago, called him a burden, laughed at his expense. Now they couldn't even breathe without feeling the weight of his silence. The machine's cold beeps had done what he hadn't needed to do, turned their laughter into fear. And he wasn't done watching them squirm. The waiter's voice trembled as he raised his head, but his words carried across the whole restaurant. All her cards have been frozen. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. The entire table went silent. Forks hovered mid-air, glasses froze in people's hands, and every mocking smile vanished at once. Gasps echoed from both family members and strangers nearby who had been following the drama with curious eyes. His mother's face drained of color, her hand still resting on her designer wallet as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. His father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, tugging at his collar like the air had suddenly grown too heavy. Segan's mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. Ao finally lifted his head. Until now, he had sat in perfect silence, letting the scene play out. But the moment the words, "All her cards have been frozen," rang out, he decided it was time. His voice broke the silence, calm, steady, and low, yet it carried more power than any shout. "Strange," he said, his eyes sweeping slowly across the table, meeting every gaze that had mocked him. "The same bank that refused me years ago just made me its majority shareholder." It was like dropping a bomb in the middle of the table. Eyes widened in disbelief. Cousins who had laughed the loudest minutes ago now sat frozen, their mouths open, their spoons slipping back into their plates. His siblings blinked as if their ears had betrayed them. His mother's lips quivered, searching for words, but nothing came. The father who had chuckled earlier now stared at Ao like he was seeing him for the first time. Even the waiter, still standing nearby, tilted his head slightly, realizing the quiet man at the table was far more than he appeared. Ao leaned back in his chair, his hands resting calmly on the table. He didn't raise his voice, didn't gloat, didn't rush. His words were enough. He let the silence stretch, watching the shock grow heavier with each passing second. It was the kind of silence that forces people to look inward, to replay every cruel word they had thrown at him, every laugh they had enjoyed at his expense. Now the balance had shifted, and they all knew it. The same relatives who once mocked him for sending small money now understood that the boy they dismissed had risen above them all. The man they had called a leech was the one who could decide whether they had access to their wealth or nothing at all. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to remind them of his sacrifices. His calm truth was enough to crush their pride. And as they stared at him, stunned into silence, Ao lifted his glass again and took a slow sip. For years they had spoken over him, laughed at him, looked down on him. Tonight, with just a few words, he had taken back all the power they thought he never had. The table no longer belonged to them, it belonged to him. The table was still frozen in shock, every eye locked on Ao as if he had just spoken a language they could not understand. For years, they thought they knew him. They thought he was the struggling son, the weak one, the one who always came begging for help. But as he sat there, calm and collected, Ao finally decided to tell them the truth. His voice was low, steady, but it carried more weight than thunder. "While you were mocking me, I was building something you never cared to ask about," he said, pausing just enough to let their silence sink deeper. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. In Nairobi, I started a tech company. I built it from nothing, sleepless nights, long days, endless risks. No one supported me, no one even believed in me, but I believed in myself. His words were not boastful, they were simple, sharp, and honest. And when the time came, I sold it, for millions. The word millions seemed to echo across the table, bouncing from cousin to cousin, sibling to sibling. No one moved. No one blinked. Their father cleared his throat, but his voice cracked as he tried to speak. And millions? It was the first time his father sounded small, fragile, unsure. His mother sat frozen, her face pale, her perfectly done makeup unable to hide the fear spreading across her expression. The same woman who had once declared he was not her ATM was now speechless in front of the son she had tried to humiliate. Ao wasn't finished. His voice grew quieter, which somehow made everyone lean in closer. With that money, I invested. I chose carefully. And one of my biggest moves was buying into the same bank you depend on. He let that sink in, his eyes sweeping across the faces that once mocked him. The bank you trust with your wealth, your comfort, your pride, is the bank I now control. The waiter still stood nearby, his eyes wide in disbelief, realizing the man sitting calmly at the table had the kind of power most people only read about. Ao glanced at him, then back at his family. Right now, I can freeze or unfreeze accounts with a single call. One call, he said, holding up a finger, slow and deliberate. That's how much things have changed. Gasps rippled across the table again, but this time there was no laughter, no jokes, no mocking smiles. Only fear and regret. Segan, who had been so loud earlier, now sat stiff, his hands under the table, his eyes refusing to meet Ao's. The cousins who had chuckled minutes ago now looked like they wanted to sink into their chairs. Ao leaned back once more, his face calm, almost bored, as if all of this was just another casual conversation. But inside, every word he spoke carried the weight of years of sacrifice and silence. His mother lowered her head, her lips trembling. His father stared at his son like a stranger. And for the first time in his life, Ao saw what he had always wanted to see, recognition. They finally understood who he had become. The table was still heavy with silence when the waiter returned, his hands almost shaking as he placed the bill down. Everyone's eyes darted toward their mother, but she kept her head down, her frozen cards lying useless in her wallet. No one dared to reach for it. The same people who had mocked Ao minutes ago now sat in shame, unable to look him in the eye. Without a word, Ao reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick bundle of cash. The crisp notes made a soft sound as he counted them out, calm and unhurried. Even the waiter froze, unsure if he was really watching what he thought he was watching. Ao placed the money neatly on the tray, his face as steady as ever. The sound of cash on the table was louder than any insult that had been thrown at him earlier. The same family that once called him a burden now watched in disbelief as he cleared the bill without blinking. Slowly, Ao slid the receipt across the table toward his parents. His eyes, sharp and cold, didn't waver as he spoke. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried like a blade. You called me an ATM? Fine, he said, pausing just long enough for every word to sink in. But ATMs don't serve the ungrateful. Gasps echoed from nearby tables. Diners who had been pretending not to listen now whispered loudly, turning their heads to watch the scene unfold. His parents shrank into their seats, their once proud shoulders drooping. His mother's lips trembled, her hand clutched her glass as if it could shield her from the truth. His father, usually full of authority, looked small, his eyes fixed on the receipt like it was a judgment handed down in court. Ao stood up slowly, pushing back his chair with quiet strength. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. All eyes were on him, from his humiliated family to the curious strangers who had witnessed the power shift of the night. His siblings sat frozen, his cousins stared at their plates, and Segan kept his head bowed, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Ao adjusted his jacket and looked around the table one last time. They had laughed at him, mocked his struggles, erased his sacrifices, and tried to brand him as worthless. But now, in the simplest way, he had reminded them of who he truly was. His silence, his cash, and his words had done what years of explaining never could. As he turned to leave, whispers filled the restaurant like a rising tide. "That's him, did you hear what he said? Did you see what he did?" The sound followed him all the way to the door. And at the table behind him, his parents sat motionless, their pride broken, their power gone. For once, Ao wasn't the one shrinking under their gaze. They were the ones shrinking under his. It was the kind of ending no one at that table would ever forget. By the next morning, Lagos was buzzing. The story had flown out of that restaurant like wildfire. People whispered about the young man who was mocked by his own family, only to stand up as the true king at the table. Everywhere Ao's name came up, markets, offices, even street corners, everyone spoke of how the beggar's son turned out to be the man holding the keys to the very bank his parents depended on. Some laughed at the irony, others admired him, but all agreed on one thing: the world would never see Ao the same way again. Relatives who had once sneered now called endlessly, their voices sweet with fake concern, begging for small favors, hoping to be in his good books. Cousins who had chuckled at his pain sent long messages of apology, pretending they had always believed in him. Even Segan, his proud brother, reached out with a shaky voice, asking for understanding. But Ao had heard it all before. He knew their tone, their hunger, their sudden respect. It was not love, it was need. Sitting alone in his quiet home, he thought back to the words that had started it all: "We're not your ATM." He let out a small laugh, not bitter, just final. They were right. He was not their ATM. He was something far greater, and unlike an ATM, he chose who to serve. Some accounts, he decided, would remain frozen forever, especially the ones that once mocked him at that golden table.